Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. We've recently launched our Patreon page, which can be found at cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon. If you aren't familiar with Patreon, it's an easy way for those who are interested in this show to help out by simply pledging a small amount each month in sponsorship. Now that could be as little as $5 a month, which is about £3.80, or as much as you like. You will enable us to dedicate more time creating more content to help you, including videos, more blog posts, and even more shows. So if you can, head over to cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon and get involved. In this episode, we talked to Jamie Taylor about .NET Core 2. Jamie is a full-stack .NET developer with a focus on web cross-platform. He lives and works in Leeds in the UK and has become the go-to guy for .NET Core at his workplace. And as some of you may be aware, Jamie was on the podcast back on episode 8, about 12 months ago, a little over 12 months ago, talking to us about .NET Core. And as Stephen King put it in the Dark Tower books, the world has moved on. And .NET Core has matured and changed. And Jamie's moved along too. He's up to no good, other things now. So welcome back to the show, Jamie.
Oh, thank you for having me on, James. It's ace to be here again.
Yeah, not a problem. It's good to have you back on. And for someone that has such a passion, I think, for something like .NET Core, it's good to get you on.
Oh, thank you.
So, as I said, Jamie's moved on a lot since we last spoke, and he's even started his own podcast, which I would assume undoubtedly that a lot of you out there would enjoy, and it's called The Waffling Tailors. So do you want to give us a bit of a rundown on what your podcast is?
Yeah, well, it's basically my brother and I sit around for about an hour or two and just talk nonsense about video games. I mean, it's one of the things that we do anyway, so I thought I might as well record it and put it out there for other people to listen to. You know, they might get anything out of it, you know, even if it just takes up an hour of someone's time while they're down the gym or going for a run or something, you know.
Yeah, that's cool. And it does go hand in hand with development. I know a lot of developers are gamers. I'm a little bit of a gamer, or used to be. I'm not as active as I once was, and I know one of my younger brothers is huge into his game, so I might have to push it over to him. I know I've listened to the first episode so far, and I got a lot of the references, but some of it was lost on me. But if you're really into your games and stuff, I think it's definitely one to get on your subscribers list. So we're here to actually talk about .NET Core again, because .NET Core has matured a little bit. But for those out there that don't know what .NET Core is, because they've been living under a rock or they're in a different world that they don't see anything to do with .NET Core, so they're in a different technology stack or something, what is .NET Core?
Okay, so .NET Core is an open source cross-platform implementation of the .NET framework. Or really, it's .NET Standard, but I can come on to that later on. So for those who don't know what .NET Framework is, it's a framework of APIs and base class libraries that facilitate rapid application development on the Windows platform. And obviously, .NET Core being cross-platform means that you can run it on a machine that runs Mac OS or a Linux distribution or a Raspberry Pi or certain models of Arduino and stuff like that. Or with it being open source means anyone can sort of go in and view the source code and make changes to it. It's kind of along the same lines as the Mono project, but it's actually endorsed by Microsoft from the get-go. Whereas, Mono was built by people who are outside of Microsoft, trying to make a .NET framework-like system for Linux and Mac OS. But this .NET Core was initially created by Microsoft engineers who work on it full time, but they've given it out to the community for people to play with and make changes, and you can have your changes sort of merged in and all that kind of stuff.
Cool. So, is the plan for this to actually replace the .NET framework entirely?
From what I can tell, it's not. .NET framework. The .NET framework is designed to run on Windows only and certain like Windows IoT and stuff. So whereas .NET Core, because it's cross-platform from the ground up, there are parts of the .NET framework that are kind of baked into the Windows kernel. So you can't really take those out and easily lift and shift to a Linux machine or a Mac or something like that.
Right.
Whereas .NET Core is designed to allow you to spin up an application and run it on slightly cheaper hardware, because there's a licensing issue with Windows. It costs you money to host on a Windows server, whereas on a Linux server, they're traditionally a little bit cheaper. They run with slightly fewer resources, so you can have more things on them. And so it's not designed to replace it. It's designed to sort of sit alongside it, so you can choose what you want your application to be able to do. If you need access to things like Active Directory and Windows services, you're going to choose .NET Framework. Whereas if you want to be able to run pretty much anywhere, you can choose .NET Core.
All right. Okay. Cool. So you mentioned .NET Standard, which gets batted about a little bit, and I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding, I think, in the community as to exactly what .NET Standard is. So how does that link into .NET Core and the .NET Framework?
Yeah, sure. Back when .NET Core was originally announced, and when it was first released, there was this kind of almost like a schism in the .NET ecosystem. So the .NET ecosystem is things like .NET Framework and Xamarin and Mono and .NET Core, which are all different technologies for doing slightly different things, but using the .NET Framework sort of stuff. And what happened was Imo Landworth, who works at Microsoft, he's the project manager for .NET Standard. He came along and said, look, each of these different platforms, if you like, in the ecosystem have their own way of implementing the stuff that we've said that the .NET framework has. They all have their own base class libraries. So these are things like their own implementations of string and XML serialization and how to perform web requests and stuff. So that meant that if you built something for .NET Framework, you couldn't easily port it to Xamarin or to Mono, for your different requirements, or for .NET Core when that was first released. So Imo and his team sat back and wrote a physical document detailing which APIs and which base class libraries need to be present for something to be classed as a .NET platform. So like .NET Framework has code which handles strings, and it has code which handles opening and closing ports and things for writing to the screen and these kind of accessing the disk and things like that. And Mono has those same things, but they're written in slightly different ways, so they can't interoperate.
Sure.
So what they did was they decided, well, why don't we write a standard that says you must be able to support X, Y, and Z to be able to be classed as a .NET ecosystem. I could, if I wanted to, and if I had the skill, I could write .NET Jamie if I wanted, and come up with a platform of my own. So long as it sticks to the standard, then I could then release it and people could use it on whichever platforms I support.
Sure.
So long as the idea is it's kind of along the same lines as the HDMI standard or the credit card standard, in that it's a description of what the system should be able to do, not how it does it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think a slightly clearer way maybe of naming it is the .NET programming standards. So it's a set of rules that the frameworks that want to work nicely with .NET have to adhere to, at least going forward anyway.
That's it, yeah. They did kind of name it badly, I think. I think you've come up with a slightly better name, if I'm honest. By calling it .NET Standard, people started asking, well, how do I install .NET Standard?
Yeah.
And it's not something that you install. It's like an esoteric thing. It's almost like a set of interfaces. If you want to support .NET Standard 1, then you must implement these particular features.
Yeah.
Like you say, it's a set of rules.
Yeah, I think it doesn't get any clearer when you start having a look at .NET Core in and .NET Standard in Visual Studio, because you actually create a .NET Standard project with .NET Standard classes, and it does feel like that maybe you're doing something different. And then when you open the class file, it looks exactly the same as the class files that you were doing in the .NET framework, but it's because it's rules about the underlying stuff that we're not touching on a day-to-day basis, really.
Yeah, it's all about how the compiler and the compiler tool chain, known as Roslyn, is all about how that takes your C# or VB.NET or F# code and converts it into the intermediary language and how it all works together.
Sure.
So like you say, it's we're not dealing with that on a day-to-day basis. We're just writing our C#, F# or VB code, and we let Visual Studio or the .NET compiler known as Roslyn, we let those tools deal with the sort of nitty-gritty for us.
Yeah. So we covered .NET Core 1.0 back in episode 8, and this is about .NET Core 2. So what's different between .NET Core 2 and .NET Core 1?
Well, I suppose the biggest difference is that .NET Core 1, they never really announced it too clearly, but .NET Core 1 was built against, sort of ratified against, version 1 of .NET Standard. And version 1 of .NET Standard didn't really have that much in it, so there were a lot of things that you couldn't do. So you couldn't really do like XML serialization and things like that. So there was a lot of people saying, hey, I can't write my .NET Framework app in .NET Core, what's the point? And Microsoft started, and the Microsoft and the community started adding things into the .NET Core base class libraries, and sort of individually. Oh, we'll have this, and we'll add that, and we'll add this, and then in the summer of 2017, because it's currently 2018 as we're recording this. That's crazy. So in the summer of 2017, Microsoft held a conference called .NET Conf, and they announced .NET Core 2, and they were saying it's being built against version 2 of the standard, which puts it in line with .NET Framework 4.61, which means that technically, and with a few caveats, almost anything you can do in .NET Framework 4.6.1, you can do in .NET Core 2. So, there's still a few things that you can't do, and a few edge cases, and there are things like there's a thing called the Windows Compatibility Pack to get certain things like Active Directory working on a .NET Core 2 application, but that is definitely going to be hosted on Windows.
Yeah.
But they've now brought the API, sort of the API surface, if you like, into line, which means that, for instance, with .NET Standard 1.6, there were now 32,000 APIs that you can call. So things for like web requests or for string manipulation, they were then included. They then also, when .NET Core 2 was announced, they then said that there would be a .NET Framework compatibility mode, which, so until that was released, your .NET Core applications could only target NuGet packages that were built for .NET Core.
Yep.
But now, because it's ratified against .NET Standard 2 and there's the .NET Framework compatibility mode, it means that out of the box, .NET Core 2 can use around 70% of all of the NuGet packages that you can find on NuGet.org.
Right. Is that only the case if you're going to run your .NET Core 2 app on a Windows box, though?
No. It works because I do all of my own personal .NET Core development on my Ubuntu machine, and I'm running packages from all over the place.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that's pretty cool. In fact, when .NET Core 2 was still in preview, I wrote a blog post showing you how it was going to work. And I wrote a .NET Core 2 console application that used Paul Seal of CodeShare.co.uk's OWASP password system, which was a NuGet package built for .NET Framework.
Yep.
So I was saying, hey, I can talk to a .NET Framework package with my .NET Core 2. How cool is this?
Yeah. Oh, no.
Sort of thing. So, and that was all on my Ubuntu machine. So that was really cool.
Yeah.
There are a few niggles and a few things that don't quite work. So the value is roughly 70%, or at least it was during the summer of 2017. The value was roughly 70% of every NuGet package on NuGet.org, and it's a rough estimate because there are millions of packages. So the Microsoft team can't go through them one by one and check them. But it does mean that certain NuGet packages will have to, the original authors of the NuGet packages will have to come along and make some tweaks and make some changes to make sure that their NuGet package targets the relevant version of the .NET standard in order to be able to be consumed with .NET Core 2, you see.
Yeah. And you mentioned there like the Active Directory stuff and things like that. And I think it's going to be by nature of the beast that's never going to be natively supported by something like .NET Core because it's Windows only. You don't get Active Directory on Linux, and you don't get Active Directory on OS X and things like that. So anything that's going to be proprietary to Windows is always going to be a baked-on afterthought, really.
Of course, yeah. But then you could write your own class library that wraps around the Active Directory stuff, and you could still have a .NET Core application that sits on a Linux server somewhere, but that makes a call to an API that's running on a Windows box. That then uses the .NET Framework based class libraries to talk to Active Directory and provide the response. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Ooh.
That's it's definitely a good way to do it, and it's breaking down your application there into more sizable chunks rather than a big monolith application. If your team can cope with it, it's if I wanted to start working with .NET Core, do I need the latest version of Visual Studio? Because I know some teams, the companies that they work for, they're still they're still running on Visual Studio. 2009, 2008, is it? Stuff like that. Are they going to be able to do any .NET Core stuff?
Well, it all depends on which version of .NET Core you want to target. So if you just need to do .NET Core 1 stuff, because there are still things that you don't need to do the latest and greatest. There are still applications out there that are running on .NET Framework 2.0, for instance, and they're out there in the wild. So if you only wanted to sort of play with .NET Core and only needed to get to grips with .NET Core 1, then you can use Visual Studio 2015 on a Windows machine, and you're good to go.
Cool.
So if you're only messing with .NET Core 1 and you're on Windows, you'll need to have at least Visual Studio 2015. And that's as far as you can get with Visual Studio 2015. But if you're not on Windows, if you're on Mac OS or on a Linux distribution, then you can use the command line interface and a text editor, or you could get Visual Studio Code, which is an open source text editor along the same lines as Atom or Electron. I suppose Electron isn't a text editor. Atom is, what's the other one? Oh, I can't remember now.
Sublime.
That's the one. Yes, Sublime. Thank you. So yeah, if you wanted to go the cross-platform route, you could install the SDK, which gives you some command line stuff that you can run, and then you can use a text editor or Visual Studio Code or Sublime or Atom. Or if you wanted to do the sort of latest and greatest, the more stable, which is .NET Core 2. There is .NET Core 2.1.3 or at the time of recording. But if you wanted to do the stable stuff, you would have to use, if you're on Windows, you would have to use Visual Studio 2017, which is confusingly known as Visual Studio 15. So that's fun.
Yeah.
But if you're using 2017, then you need to be on, if you're using 2017 before update 4, then the .NET Core SDK will not be installed for you. You have to install that separately. And you do that by going to the .NET/core, and that will present you with different ways of installing it. If you're on update 4 or greater for Visual Studio 2015, then it can install the SDK for you alongside itself. But there's also Rider, which is made by JetBrains, who also have created things like IntelliJ and stuff like that. They really know how to make an IDE, and it really shows with Rider.
Yeah.
And again, you can use Visual Studio Code if you want. There's lots of different tools.
Yeah, Visual Studio Code is something that I've been using a little bit more recently myself, both on Mac OS and on Windows as well. But less for .NET stuff, more the web front end stuff. So like React and Angular that I've been playing around with a little bit. Yeah. So if you actually want to use .NET Core 2.x, whatever version that is that is out now, you need Visual Studio 2017 on Windows. At least you can't do anything in VS Code or Rider with 2. Then have I got that right?
Sorry, no, yeah, no, sorry. If you wanted to go down the Visual Studio route, you have to have 2017.
Yep.
You can use Visual Studio Code or Rider or Sublime or any kind of text editor that you wanted on Windows. The only thing is that if you used a bare text editor or Sublime or things like that, then you would have to use the command line to run your application and to add packages and things like that.
Sure.
Whereas, things like Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, and Rider have GUI options for you. You can right-click something and add a package, or you can push a button and it will do the build for you.
Yeah, so it just depends on how hardcore you are or how lazy you are. I'm a sucker for a nice UI rather than command line. But the way of the world at the moment, everything is reverting back to command line interfaces. It's the cool thing to do now, and in some instances it is the nice way to go. I just have nightmares where I wake up in cold sweats thinking about things I had to do in command line that I now have nice UIs for. But I digress. That's a personal preference. Anyway, I've been playing around with .NET Core 1 and a little bit with .NET Core 2 myself, and I've built a few simple things, but mainly they've been sort of core components, so class libraries and that end up talking to like the likes of REST APIs. But what else can I use .NET Core to build? Is the stuff that I can't build with .NET Core?
Well, right off the bat, there is a technical limitation with .NET Core in that you can't. So with .NET Framework, if you fire up Visual Studio, you can go, I'd like to create a WinForms application. And you get a GUI and you get these drag and drop tools, and you can say, I'll have a panel and a text box and a button, which is fine. But because of the nature of .NET Core, simply because it's cross-platform and all the different operating systems have different ways of drawing things on screen, like on a low level behind the scenes. There isn't a single GUI builder that exists for all of the platforms. So .NET Core just does not ship with one. So from the get-go, you can't build a desktop application that has a GUI. There are third-party libraries that will allow you to do that. And there are things like Qt and Xamarin Forms, and they are very good at what they do. And you can use those if you wanted to, and you could have a Qt application or a Xamarin Forms application talk to a .NET Core library and display things on screen. And interestingly, so Xamarin is obviously part of the .NET Core ecosystem. And at .NET Conf 2017, Miguel de Icaza, the project manager for Xamarin, showed and announced that Xamarin was coming to the desktop. So he showed an application running on Xamarin Forms, but on a Mac OS and on an Ubuntu machine. So it's something that the folks at Microsoft are actually thinking about. How do we make GUI applications that are cross-platform?
Sure.
So it is coming. But the canonical examples of stuff you can do with .NET Core are things like building a web service with MVC or single page applications with one of the millions of JavaScript frameworks like Angular, React, or Vue, or Knockout, things like that. Web API stuff, so like you were saying, like a REST API, or even just a console application or a class library. You can also build, so .NET Core is built in .NET Core, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So you can build things in .NET Core which enhance .NET Core stuff. So you can build in ASP.NET Core, which is the library that sits on top of .NET Core, which gives you access to web stuff, so MVC and single page applications and stuff. As your HTTP request comes in, it jumps into a pipeline, and each of the components which deal with your request are called middleware, and you can build your own custom middleware to slot into other applications. And I've created one or two of those, and I've written about how to do that too, and a little description of how that actually works. So, and that's really easy to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've made it a lot simpler than in the .NET Framework days, where you had to mess about with IIS and load things in and stuff. It was a little difficult back in the day.
Yeah. So your .NET Core web stuff runs its own web server as such. Then with something like Owen, I guess.
Yes. So the ASP.NET Core web server is called Kestrel.
Right.
And Microsoft have been saying since ASP.NET Core 2, I get them mixed up all the time, but ever since ASP.NET Core 2, since ASP.NET Core was announced, they've been saying do not put Kestrel out there as a web server facing the internet, because it's not built to be able to do that yet.
Right.
So you still need to use Apache or IIS or Nginx or something that sits as a reverse proxy between your application and Kestrel and the outer internet, because it doesn't do request filtering and that kind of thing. So yeah, it does come with a web server, but it's not internet ready, I think is the phrase that they use.
So it could be opening you up to all sorts of exploits and nasties on the internet if you use that.
Indeed, yeah.
Right.
And to be fair, other teams have done web servers better. You can't really expect one team of, all right, here's the community, but you can't really expect one team of people to come up with absolutely everything you could ever use. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So earlier on, you mentioned that .NET Core is open source. What does that mean? Can we contribute to the .NET Core Foundation project? Have you contributed to the project at all?
Yeah, anyone can contribute to the .NET Core, the Core CLR, which is the command line, the common runtime, or there's the Roslyn. You can contribute to that, or any of the other different components. You can contribute to one of the libraries if you wanted. So say there was something in system.xml that you didn't like, or rather that wasn't written very well, or there was a bug, you could actually go to, it's all hosted on GitHub. So as long as you have a GitHub account, you can sign in, fork the repository, so copy the repository to your account, make some changes, and then push the changes back and submit a pull request for one of the Microsoft engineers to have a look at your changes and go, actually, that's pretty good, and then merge it into the mainline repository, which would then mean the next release has your changes in it.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, and the documentation works exactly the same. The official documentation for .NET, for all of .NET, is built from a bunch of GitHub repos. So if there's a spelling issue, or if there's a technical issue, or if something's just not covered, like if there is, string.split wasn't, which is an API method for splitting strings.
Yep.
Which is, if that wasn't documented, you could go in and submit the documentation for it And then, within a few minutes, assuming it passes quality checks, within a few minutes, your changes would then be on the official documentation.
Cool. That's really good. And I know of one area that it's missing stuff from at the moment, and that is consuming RSS feeds, which I know we've spoken about as a side for this. So somebody out there needs to go and build that, because otherwise we end up writing really hacky XML parsers that go and read the RSS in. But
Exactly.
yeah, so somebody with a little bit more talent than me and a little bit more time could go and do that. There's an idea.
Definitely. The other thing with everything being on GitHub as well is that the project management team for .NET Core and ASP.NET Core announce things on GitHub that they're going to work on. So they'll have a long list of, say, 20 or 30 features that will be in the next release.
Right.
And they actively encourage people from the community to go on to GitHub, look through the announcement and say, oh, brilliant, we'll definitely, you will definitely need that, or we need this bug fixing, and we need this feature, and that kind of thing. And because obviously most of the development work is being done by Microsoft engineers, they want help from the community to figure out which things are more important.
Sure.
So then they can devote their own developer time to, they don't want to spend 6 weeks developing a feature that no one's going to use,
Yeah.
So, they're actively encouraging people to go on to these repos, have a look, and you can thumb up and thumb down stuff. So if there's something on there that doesn't make sense, why would you need a parser for this, esoteric file format? Thumb down, and then it might not get made. Or, we want system.drawing, which wasn't available for a long time. Yes, thumbs up, please. And then eventually that will, they'll plan around it and implement it, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's good. So the other one is, have you got anything that's in .NET Core yet?
I haven't yet.
Oh.
I know. I think I'm going to have to spend some time looking through, going on bug hunts, see what I can find something easy.
Yeah, just don't go through and just change the formatting and things, as a mutual friend, I believe, did on another open source project and broke it.
Oh no!
Yeah.
I do remember back in the early days of .NET Core, they were issuing challenge coins and sending out like thank you cards to people.
Nice.
But I don't know whether they still do that.
Yeah, I do remember the challenge coins, and I so desperately wanted one. But with all the projects that I've got going on and everything else, I was never able to get involved, unfortunately.
I had the same problem. Oh,
sure. Well, such is life. We'll have to go on eBay and see if they're for sale yet, and buy one, and then pretend that we earned it.
That's it.
So if I wanted to learn a little bit more about what we've talked about today, and I know I've already started building, but if the listeners out there wanted to start building stuff with .NET Core, could you make any suggestions of training courses, blogs, or anything like that they should go and have a look at?
Yeah. Well, I mean, aside from trying to not sell, but aside from trying to push people to my own website, which I'm sure that'll be in the show notes. But there are a few Microsoft Virtual Academy courses. So back when I was last on the show, there were a few sort of early attempts at doing Microsoft Virtual Academy courses, and it is still just a case of sit and watch. Okay, try it for myself. Sit and watch. Try it for myself. But it's really well done. The early ones were done by Scott Hanselman, and there are a bunch of new ones now. The first two are Scott Hanselman and people like Maria Nagaga and people like that, who are sitting with him, and they talk you through how the request pipeline works and how you can load configuration as part of the application startup automatically, and how dependency injection and Kestrel and things like that work. And they've split them into 3 courses covering beginner, intermediate, and advanced topics. And I sent through some links, so hopefully they'll be in the show notes. But they are really good. They are really good.
Yeah, well, we'll get those linked up for people to go and have a look at, and I will go and have a look at those myself as well. Because I probably need to brush up a little bit on my .NET Core skills. Because like I said, I've done a few REST APIs, and I've been using NancyFX .NET Core version, and I ported over my ORM to .NET Core. Started doing some more with that. Found out how poor it was. Doing single requests, it's really quickly, but if you have to do a lot of repetitive stuff, it slows down quite quick. So that needs me to find a spare few hours and go and sit down with that in .NET Core and get that working properly. But it's definitely very interesting what's happening now. I think Mono paved the way a little bit before. Now we've got .NET Core coming along. So I think .NET is here for a lot longer than people talk about. I've on multiple occasions been told by the Java developers that the .NET isn't going to be around in 10 years' time, but I really think it might be. I think this could be a very big turning point for the .NET framework. I think there's some very interesting things to come.
Definitely. I mean, I feel like there's a group called the .NET Foundation, which are the people who sort of work alongside Microsoft and Apple and Google and things like that. These are the people who sort of sponsor the development of .NET. They've put out something that sounds awfully like what Java originally promised, which is write once, compile once, run anywhere.
Yeah.
And it kind of does. Like there is a version. I found it on GitHub earlier on today. There's a feature request to get .NET Core running on Android.
Oh, nice.
And they're in the process of making it work with Android, which is it's mental that I can create something on the desktop, on a relatively powerful desktop, and then push a button and send it across to my phone, and it also runs on my phone.
Yeah.
Or push a button and send it to the Raspberry Pi in the living room, and it runs on the Raspberry Pi. It's really cool.
Yeah. I think you could have some fun with that. Get different kit together and send the application out to all the different ones and see which device burns to the ground first. or is that just my code that does that to machines?
Well, I mean, it depends on whether you include the burn it to the ground NuGet package.
Yeah. I really should take that off NuGet. I've got so many lawsuits because of it. Anyway, so thanks for coming on and talking to us again about .NET Core. I think we'll cut it off there before it gets too silly.
Thank you for having me on again, James. It's been ace again.
Yeah, not a problem at all. And undoubtedly, we'll probably have you back for .NET Core 3 when that comes out and see where we're going with that.
Definitely.
Yeah. But thanks to you guys and girls out there. Thanks for listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Jamie Taylor talking about .NET Core 2. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.